Coming up on Maine Challenge, two members of the ACLU from Maine. Hello and welcome to Maine Challenge, a production of Lincoln County TV and Lincoln County Indivisible. Today our guests are from the ACLU of Maine. We have Executive Director Allison B.A. and we have the legal counsel, Zach Hayden. He's the courtroom guy, I guess. Welcome both of you. Allison, give us a little bit of history of the organization and Maine.
Yeah, well, love to talk about the ACLU. It's a very part of who I am and who Zach is, so we love to talk about that. The ACLU has been in Maine for over 50 years, although the organization started actually in 1920. The first ACLU was founded back 100 years ago. But in Maine, we have a long history, 50 years, and many of the people that still are present in the legal community here in Maine came together in 50 years ago and felt that there was a real need for individual rights to be protected against government intrusion. And that isn't just about issues of privacy and security, but also about racial discrimination. One of our early cases had to do with discrimination against an African-American serviceman who was discriminated against up in more northern parts of the state. And so people came together understanding that the liberties that we feel are so important and are enshrined in the Constitution need a champion. And so they came together to form the chapter of the ACLU of Maine. And for 50 years, we've been going strong thanks to members around the state, many members in Lincoln County. So super, super happy about that. And we have been on a path to really, I think many years ago, we might've said to protect the Constitution, but I think right now it would be better said to protect the promise of the Constitution, the values that really underpin the Constitution, because we all know that many things were flawed in the original writing of the Constitution. So that's what we're here for. We're here to protect the promise of the Constitution.
Interesting point. And I, for one, am very glad that you're here and fighting the good fight. Zach, I totally screwed up your introduction, so maybe you can tell us what your title really is.
Hi, my name is Zach Hayden. I'm Chief Counsel at the ACLU of Maine. And the part you got right is that I spent a lot of time in court talking about the issues that we care about and our members care about to judges, trying to convince courts, both the state courts here in Maine as well as the federal courts, to take steps to enforce the law in ways that are going to, as Allison said, make the promise of the Constitution a reality in people's lives. I also do some policy work with the Maine legislature, which is how, Chuck, we got to know each other first back when you were serving in the legislature 12 years ago, I think probably is when we met. Yeah, and and with local governments as well, and municipal governments, and the executive branch. Really, if there's a decision maker that needs to be convinced, I'm part of the team that tries to convince them that they need to change the behavior or take steps to enforce people's rights.
And you do good work, and
Thank you.
A number of times in my lifetime I have said quietly, I think, that I'm very thankful that you folks are there. And I'm sure there are a few times where people say, curse you, but
I hope so.
Isn't that so? Can the ACLU of Maine be proactive on issues, or is it always, I'll see you in court?
That's a great question. And I think, I don't know, Zach, if you would agree, but I think, one of the core functions of the ACLU is to react to whatever crisis is at hand. And so I think you've seen the ACLU, particularly in the last 4 years, be able to immediately react to challenges to people's rights all over the country. But that doesn't happen without planning and foresight and thinking and actually more proactive work. So a lot of what we're doing is actually assessing and evaluating what's happening in the legislature, Chuck, what a committee might be thinking about, or what happened last session. We'll be working with our allies to say, you know, what is an injustice in your community that you feel like is really critical to bringing about the kind of community you want to see. So it is a mix. So we are certainly here as sort of a first responder in a crisis, but it comes because we have a lot of planning. And I know that that's true, Zach, for you as well in the litigation in your docket. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, voting, just to take one example, we've spent you know, a lot of the last 6 months thinking about this election that we're going to have in November, and what are the things that can go wrong? What are problems that could come up that would make it harder for people to register to vote or to vote, to exercise their right to vote? And what are some things we can do ahead of time to try to mitigate against that? And that's been important work, but we're also planning on, you know, what's going to happen the week and the leading up to the election and election day itself, to be able to respond quickly to the problems that we didn't think of. It's always, you know, we always have to save space in our brains and in our work plans for those things that we just did not anticipate, because they always come up. And
this year, how can you even predict? I mean, there are so many variables and so many issues and problems, and I don't know if there's a place for your work in the post office crisis that's being thrown upon us. But I know a lot of people who are concerned about more than just the election, and it's their lives and how they live their lives. And you know, it's hard to imagine how this is all going to play out, but I guess we'll do the best we can. Do you feel like the voters are well enough informed, Allison?
Well, that's a great question, and that's probably a hard question to answer. I think Maine has some of the highest voting rates in the country. We should be really proud of that. Although it's still far lower than we would like to see. You know, we would hope to have 100% voting in every country. It's just that hasn't been the way democracy has gone about. So I think Maine can be proud of its, you know, how its voters interact and are educated. But you know, I think there is a lot more room for us to improve. I think a lot of us have thought that there have been, you know, the ACLU doesn't work a lot in the sphere of education, although there's increasing conversations about that because, you know, whether we're talking about not knowing our history around Indigenous peoples or not knowing our history with relation to slavery, that also goes, it's just generally civic education about what does it mean to be an active participant in your democracy. And so a lot of what the ACLU does when people think of us as lawyers, which we are, but we're also advocates and do public education. And so a lot of what we try to do is put out information to make sure voters are better educated. And of course, you know, Zach has, you know, although Zach is, you know, he's not as old as me, but he's not a young folk anymore, but he has mastered the art of social media. So he uses social media quite well, as has the rest of the office. I myself am just, you know, I'm just going to call it a day on social media and make sure that the team of the ACLU, but we do a lot through social media. We do a lot through written documents. We do a lot through presentations to groups to try to make sure that people do know. But I think we all could agree that sort of civic engagement and civic discourse has been threatened in this country over years of defunding of education, and we should all be playing a part to change that.
Yeah, I like the way you answer that question, Allison. That they think about the way you asked, Chuck, is, you know, do voters have the information? Are they informed? You know, one way of answering that is to think of like, well, leading up to the election, do people have that sort of specific information about how do I request my absentee ballot? Which, by the way, you can go onto the Maine Secretary of State's website and do that, request your absentee ballot, and you should. Or where do I vote? You call your town clerk and they'll tell you where exactly your polling place is. Those sort of specific hard information. But the really important part of your question, which is I think what Allison was getting at, was like, do voters understand the role that they play in a democracy? And that doesn't start in, you know, that's not September before the election or October before the election. That has to start in elementary school. That has to start in preschool, that people, we're training people to participate in our democracy and to be informed. And that's, you know, that's not work that I can, you know, do a lawsuit that's going to fix that. That's something that's all of our responsibilities as a community to make sure that people have the information to participate in democracy, because that's something everybody does, not just lawyers and judges and politicians.
You'll recall that in the past few legislatures, we've had several bills that had to do with voter fraud and stopping voter fraud. And all the research, all the information we could gather said, well, there's really not very much voter fraud, but then there's a whole lot of voter suppression, maybe not in Maine, I don't know, but there's certainly around the country, voter suppression is a very serious problem. And I would think that would be in your lane in terms of fighting back, Zach.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were in the legislature back in 2010, 11, 12, when there were proposals brought forth for Maine to start having a voter ID law. And it took a lot of work by a lot of people around the state, a really bipartisan, nonpartisan effort to make sure people understood that these are laws don't protect voting. They don't solve any problem. What they do is they cause problems for people. They make it harder for people who have a right to vote to exercise that right to vote with no real benefit. But that's not, that's not a thing that happens on its own. It took a lot of work with a lot of people of making that case and showing the data. What you just said, that voter fraud is a myth that people trot out to try to make laws that are actually suppressive of people's right to vote.
Allison, does the ACLU have a role to play in the pre-election, the run-up to make sure that it is possible for older folks to vote, and for people in various districts, all of a sudden polls just closed. The polling places aren't open anymore, and you don't even have the information you need to go where you need to go. Is that something the ACLU can address?
Absolutely, and we're addressing it here in Maine and across the country. And so it is a really important issue. And you mentioned, we wouldn't typically think of voter suppression happening in Maine, but it happens in many ways, both subtle and not so subtle. And so we have been working since, we're part of a voting rights coalition that always works together. I'm very proud of that coalition and the work that we do together. But we've been working as a group since this, early parts of the summer to be thinking about all of these potential challenges. What does it mean if someone wants to close, if they want to consolidate into one polling place, and does it discriminate against certain communities, or even something as simple as postage? We think of, if you want to take an absentee ballot and mail it back, we assume, we'll just mail it in. Not every family in Maine, and particularly with COVID, the amount of economic stress that families are under, it could be that one barrier, that one step that is just, I can't get to the post office to get a stamp. So these are the kinds of things that we see. And so it certainly doesn't look like what our colleagues in North Carolina are fighting against, or our colleagues in Georgia, or our colleagues across the country. But absolutely, the ACLU, one of the great strengths of our organization is we have offices in every state. So there are people on the ground and ACLU members on the ground working hard, and have been working hard for many months, some places for years, to make sure that every person can vote and that every vote counts, which is really what we should all want in our democracy. And that should not be a partisan issue. That should just be a core part of our democracy. And the votes cast, as they do. But we should be all striving to make sure every person who wants to vote can vote.
That's a very basic tenet of our democracy, which I think a lot of people sometimes forget. My granddaughter, who's only 15, is very concerned because a friend of hers who lives out of state has been told that there will be, again, this isn't in Maine, but has been told that there will be armed poll watchers, which sounds to me like pure intimidation. Because I just can't imagine what the threat would be that the police or whatever can't handle. Have you heard about any of that, especially in Maine?
Well, yeah, I'll let Zach, you want to, but I say we're talking about that across the country. And Zach and I actually have a call at 2:00 today where we've been working on scenarios and what we will do in those situations. But obviously we're deeply concerned about the federal government using intimidation with acts of, authority that could, keep people from voting. So I think we're definitely concerned, which is all the more plug for every one of your viewers is to, request your absentee ballot, get your absentee ballot, get it back. And so that the pressure on the polls on the day of the election is as little as possible. But Zach, do you want to talk about what you've been hearing in your calls around the country?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very real possibility. And I think if any of us have learned anything over the last 4 years, it's to not write off something because it seems implausible. We should, I hope that armed militia groups or whatever stationing themselves outside of a polling place doesn't happen anywhere in this country. But I just don't think we can take it off the list of things that we're worried about. So this is obviously not a new phenomenon in our country's history. In parts of this country, having people actually, blocking access to polling places was a long, sad tradition, and it's entirely possible that it will return, and that we will count on both our local officials, our attorney generals in our states and chief law enforcement officers in our states, to make sure that the laws in place that protect polling places and that protect voters from intimidation and harassment are enforced, but also our judges, that our judges are going to be there to enforce those laws, whether it's the ACLU going into court or one of our fellow organizations going into court to make sure that conduct isn't allowed to happen.
I remember serving one term on the Judiciary Committee that there was a real concern, but this is, of course, 10, 12 years ago, but a real concern about the security in the courthouses, that the budget was just simply not sufficient to protect public safety and court personnel in the courthouses in Maine. Has that improved any?
Yes, it has, and it's an ongoing process. But our courts, we have a number of courthouses all over the state, and some of them are more modern than others and have more updated facilities. But yeah, there have been some significant developments in security, making sure that people, when they're coming to court, when they're coming seeking justice, when they're trying to defend their innocence, and if it's a criminal matter, that they are able to do that safely and not have to fear that they're going to be subject to harassment. I mean, this was even an issue that we were dealing with early on in this president's administration, with ICE agents actually going to courthouses here in Maine and across the country, and subjecting people to detention for immigration issues while they're in court for something unrelated, maybe a family matter or some other matter. And that is something we raised the issue with our state's judges and our Chief Justice, that people should be able to access justice in the state without having to fear from really anybody, but especially fear from government agents.
Yeah. One of the issues that I think is concerning everywhere, but also certainly in Maine, is the issue of rights for immigrants, legal rights for immigrants, LGBTQ folks, and women, minorities. What is happening these days in terms of sort of proactively helping people make sure that they get the rights that they deserve as humans and as citizens?
Yeah, that is something that obviously this country has been struggling with since its inception and from before. And so we have not accomplished our promises of those constitutions. So I think all of the groups you're mentioning are still struggling, whether it's discrimination. I mean, the COVID crisis has shown, if there was any doubt before that we have a challenge of certain people are treated differently in this country than others, COVID has made it clear that that is, it is absolutely true. So we are seeing disparities in healthcare, in education, in access to services, just in everything. And Maine has one of the worst disparity rate in the COVID infections of people of color being at much higher risk than white people here in Maine. So we are seeing, if racism has never, it was always here, it is still here, and it is something that all of us have to address and be committed to taking measures to stamp it out. So we're doing a lot of work with a lot of wonderful organizations around the state. And I mean, I think you mentioned so many important communities that we care about, and one of the really important lessons is those communities have the solutions to their problems. And so communities know what they need. And so as advocates, we try to find out what those needs are and then figure out how we can support them. So in the immigrant community, our role may be one thing, or in the LGBT community, it might be another. And so as an organization, we try to listen and understand, although, Zach has been really a key part of this in our organization, although, oftentimes we'd be like, Zach, come on, just go sue someone, just go, just do it. Zach's like, no, we got to figure out what really the community needs. And so it's been really an important part of understanding, because as when you're established, so although some people may think ACLU is a little bit on the sidelines, we still know that the ACLU is a very established legal organization with a long track record. And so we also want to make sure that we are not supplanting our will for those groups that we're advocating for. So that's how we do our advocacy, in combination with lots of other groups here in Maine, really fighting for people's rights.
Yeah, and the ACLU, we work on a lot of different issues, and as people, staff members, there's different things that brought us to the ACLU, or different issues that resonate most strongly with us. But I think that anti-discrimination work that you're pointing to is what brought Allison to the organization and what resonates most strongly for her. One of the issues connected to that we talk about a lot is you can have discrimination, and we have in this country for many years had forms of discrimination that are actually written into the law. You have a law that says Black people cannot vote, but much more common is what we call sort of de facto discrimination. There's nothing explicit in the law that says we're going to discriminate against Native people, or we're going to discriminate against people who are lesbians. But we have things in the law, structures in the law, that have the effect of discriminating, and those are just as pernicious and just as damaging. So we have to find ways to fight against those as well. It's a little harder because you have that additional step of trying to make people understand how this discrimination is happening. And I think that's really where what Allison was saying about the communities themselves are able to articulate what this discrimination means in ways that I can't for communities that I'm not a member of.
And it's so hard to find and isolate, because so many of the victims are not speaking up because it's not in their nature, and they haven't lived all their lives in the U.S. and realized that there is some freedom of speech. And so it must be very hard. It's a very tall order to address this sort of systemic immigration issue and some of the others. That's very tough. And I salute you for the work you're doing. What are some of the bigger cases that are in the works right now, Zach?
So one thing we've been dealing with, we've been spending a lot of time trying to think about the ways that the current global pandemic implicates rights and concerns that all of us have. And that touches on so many different areas. The one we've been thinking about today and the last week is obviously people who are incarcerated. The government has taken away their liberty. They're in jail. Maybe they're just awaiting trial and they can't afford bail, or maybe they've been sentenced to some time of confinement. But once the state does that, the state takes on an obligation to look after their health and safety. And we've seen an outbreak. I think one of the worst outbreaks, or maybe the worst outbreak in the state, at York County Jail, where the state was not living up to its obligation to make sure that people are kept safe that are in their custody. So I don't know whether that's going to end up being litigation. I mean, I suspect it's going to be litigation by many people. I don't know if the ACLU will be among them, but it's certainly a huge problem with constitutional implications that we're very concerned about.
Thank you.
And there are a bunch of others.
We could go for an hour, but we're almost out of our half-hour time. So I wanted to at least touch on the issue of prison reform and restorative justice. We've had several people on, and it's obviously catching some attention now, the whole idea of restorative justice. How does the ACLU fit into that?
So that is an issue that's obviously very close to the ACLU's heart, Zach, and I like to talk about how the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, actually, the framers were deeply concerned about the criminal legal system. Half of the Bill of Rights relate to actually how the government can treat you if you're accused of a crime. So we've always, as an organization, cared about it. But the reason that we have so focused on it in Maine, and other affiliates are doing that as well, is because of the unbelievably direct connection between white supremacy, racism, and our criminal legal system. And so many of your viewers will probably have read the new Jim Crow, a book by Michelle Alexander, a former ACLU attorney, that talks about how, that slavery and white supremacy just continues to find a new way of oppressing, particularly Black people, but also brown people and other communities of color, indigenous folks. But that the criminal legal system has, in essence, become, since the 1970s, a way of disenfranchising people of color from our communities, whether it means they take their actual lives and liberty or it takes their right to vote. And so it is an incredibly important issue for us here in Maine. And I would say that, just to a question from before, I think it's really important for us to remember in Maine, and we hear this a lot, racism isn't such a big problem in Maine. We're the whitest state in the country, and so it can't be a problem here. I've heard that from colleagues, from other lawyers. It's just, and I think it is critical that people understand racism is absolutely a problem in Maine, and it is not just an issue of racism towards people who come from other countries, immigrants. It has been happening to Black people who were born in Maine, who have been here generations. And so it is in the water. It is in how we are raised. It is impossible to grow up in America without having a racial hierarchy imposed on us. So here in Maine, we have just as much an obligation to work on, being anti-racist. And so we see that as prison reform, what you're talking about, as criminal legal reform. So everything we do, many of Zach's cases and his colleague Emma Bond, their cases relate to trying to keep people out of jail and prison who, don't need to be there, never needed to be there, and whether they're there has much more to do with the size of their checkbook or the color of their skin. So we do a lot of advocacy in the court and legislature. If you were still in the legislature, you would be sick of us in their committees talking about this over and over again, and trying to explain to people that the system we have, this sort of public safety system, is really just a fabrication. It's been built up on this idea that we have to put people in jail.
But thank you both very much for joining us today. Allison B.A. and Zach Hayden from the ACLU Maine. Thanks for being part of the Maine Challenge.
Thanks for having us.
Show your support for Maine Challenge and LCTV's programming. We're all about community. Please go to lctv.org to make a contribution. Your support makes us stronger together.